This is speaking of technology. This is an AI-created image that I put into my presentation this morning. Anyway. Where do we start? Okay, 2 weeks ago, Cambridge University Press published my new book called "To Run the World." You'll see it out there. It's on the stand at the reception. It took 10 years to write, and it has 2,100 footnotes. And the idea was to try to explain Soviet foreign policy during the Cold War. And I was dissatisfied in the end with myself. And I'm just telling this seminar here, right? Because I'm trying to sell this book as hard. I know, actually, there's going to be Swedish edition thanks to Axel Johnson Foundation. I'm very grateful. But I'll tell you why I was dissatisfied. I think the book is, frankly, I think the book is very interesting. But there's an issue. And that is the lingering question that remains. Why did the Soviet Union lose the Cold War? I mean, fundamentally, what is the problem? The problem, I know, because I was in the system, the problem was that it simply did not have the right economic system. It was not that it was outspent. It was not that it was outgunned by the Reagan administration. It just simply did not work. And if you lived in that system, you would know that nothing was working. That is fundamentally the problem. The cause of Soviet collapse, or the causes, were fundamentally internal, and they have to do with the Soviet failure to deliver on the promise of material abundance. In other words, if I were asked to come up with one phrase to chisel into the gravestone of the Soviet Empire, I think I would use Bill Clinton's well-known phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." Another AI-generated image. So in my very brief remarks here today, I will explore 3 questions. First, when did the Soviet leaders understand that communism was not working? Second, what did they try to do about it? And third, why did it not work? And a small footnote, I'm trying to write a new book about those very questions. So I'm very pleased with this opportunity because it allows me to formulate my thoughts and actually get into writing. My publisher is already on my back asking, where are the chapters? And nothing has been produced. So I'm trying to now work through the materials and trying to figure it out. Let me begin by telling you that I think the most important year for understanding the failure of the Soviet Union was 1962. Okay, we all know what happened in 1962. It's the Cuban Missile Crisis. But this is not the reason why I think it's very important. This is not the reason. Something else happened in 1962, which I think is interesting for understanding the causes of Soviet collapse. And I would say the story that I would like to tell here begins with Khrushchev's decision in June of 1962 to raise prices on meat, milk, and poultry. And by the way, this decision and the discussion was happening at the very time that he decided to send missiles to Cuba. So it sort of overlaps in time, which is very interesting. So he decides to send missiles to Cuba. At the same time, he decides to raise prices on meat, milk, and poultry. Correlation, not causation. Okay? Why is that important? Well, let me give you a bit of a background here. Khrushchev, of course, we know Khrushchev as a shoe-slamming, bear-hugging, sometimes boasting, often menacing prophet of the dawn of communism. Here he is famously in July 1959 sparring with Nixon in the famous kitchen debates. Remember those? There's a YouTube video, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Khrushchev goes there with Nixon and Nixon tells him, well, but we have televisions and we have this and we have that. And Khrushchev said, no, this is all rubbish. We're better. And of course, this was really at the heart of Khrushchev's project of creating material abundance. I mean, this is interesting because Khrushchev was trying to challenge the United States in an area where the Americans were at their best, frankly. He could have said, well, communism is just better because it was fair. You know, it's a bit, you know, we have a greater equality or something like that. But no, he decided to try to beat the United States in rampant consumerism, in producing material abundances. That's the idea of communism, right? You produce, or at least that's how Khrushchev thought. You produce and produce and produce, and then you have enough stuff where it just goes around for free, everybody's happy. Behold the dawn of communism. And indeed, in 1959, the same year that this happened here, kitchen debate, Khrushchev promises to outproduce the United States in milk, meat, and butter. And in 1961, in October 1961, two things happened. First, the Soviets detonate the Tsar bomb, 58 megaton nuclear weapon, the biggest ever detonated. But in the very same time, Khrushchev promises that this generation of Soviet people will live under communism. That's a big promise. That's a big promise that he makes in 1961. But the image of the USSR as a land of milk and honey simply did not accord with reality. So what is the main problem? The main problem, there are lots of problems with the Soviet economy already in the early 1960s, but if I were to just point to the main problem, it's basically that there are too many rubles in the economy and nothing to spend them on, because it was not delivering. The economy was not delivering. So you have all these rubles, but there's nothing to buy. It's a deficit economy, right? So how do you fix that? And so Khrushchev decided to try to redress this problem. The way to do that was to raise prices. On meat, milk, and poultry. And as I mentioned, he does that in June 1962. And guess what? The people don't like it. In fact, riots break out. This is, of course, the city of Novocherkassk in southern Russia, southern Soviet Union. People are demonstrating. This here says, turn Khrushchev into sausage. Because the prices were raised 30%. So people were... how did this end? It ended with a brutal crackdown by KGB troops and police forces, with multiple people being killed and then some more later being executed for subversion and for rioting. That is really, you know, that sort of raises a big question about the Soviet system. People are going out, prices are, you basically have inflation, prices are rising, people are go out to demonstrate into the streets. All of that is happening in June 1962, just as Khrushchev was projecting Soviet power overseas into Cuba. And what happens? You know, people are shut down. Where is the promise of communism? It does not arrive. But that's Novocherkassk in 1962 is not the only reason. It's not the only reason why 1962 is important. Another reason was an article that was published on September 9, 1962 by one professor from Kharkov called Evsei Liberman. And the article was published in Pravda, in the newspaper. It was called The Plan, Profit and Bonuses. And the article emphasized the profit motive, the importance of the profit motive, and encouraged material incentives as a way to increase labor productivity. Think about it, material incentives in the communist system, right? That's a big surrender to market already, right there. And this article starts a debate among the Soviet economists that leads, well, I'll tell you in a second what it leads to. In the meantime, though, Khrushchev is overthrown. He's overthrown in October 1962, not least for the economic problems, because already by 1963, for example, the situation in the agriculture in the Soviet Union is so dire that there's no growth at all. The growth of agricultural production from 1961 to 1963 is 0%. And there's a shortage because of drought in 1963. So for the first time, the Soviet Union is forced to import grain from abroad, spending 860 tons of gold to import grain to feed their people. Where is communism that you're supposed to, that's supposed to arrive within a generation? So Khrushchev is overthrown, and he's replaced by Brezhnev and Kosygin, and it is Kosygin whose name is attributed to the reforms that are then launched that emphasize this question of material incentives, giving people money in order to stimulate greater labor productivity. And there's a remarkable Politburo discussion that happens in January 1966, which we have a whole archival record of, where Brezhnev and Kosygin are basically discussing the problem of the Soviet economy. They understand there are huge problems. They understand. And so Brezhnev is saying, well, how do we fix that? How about we give more money to the people so that they get stimulated, that they can produce more? I mean, this is very market thinking for a general secretary of the Communist Party, wouldn't you say? And then Brezhnev says, well, how about this? What if we get people, for example, to start small enterprises like tailor shops and produce clothing? That would be very good for them. And then Kosygin says, well, here's what we need to do. We need to allow pensioners, people who are retirees, to start up restaurants. And somebody says, well, wait a second, this violates the principle of, communism, etc., because that would be sort of private business. And Kosygin says, well, don't worry, what's going to happen is this is going to be a cooperative. It's a cooperative, no hired labor. They'll just work together and they'll produce food. So this is going to be great. So that's all happening in 1966. But the lack of material incentives wasn't the only problem and not the only solution that they discussed at that time. There was another idea at that time, and that was the computer revolution, because Soviet leaders understand that something is happening in the United States and in the West more broadly that may have impact on them. And they look at the US for an example, and in the same Politburo meeting in January 1966, when they talk about problems of Soviet economy, there's this really interesting discussions about American computers. And somebody says, well, just General Electric alone has more computing power than the entire Soviet Union. How are we going to fix this? What are we going to do about this? Then in 1968, in July 1968, Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, writes a letter to Brezhnev saying, we are losing the race with the United States for computers. The Americans have 40,000 computers. We only have 2,500. It's going to get worse. And he has, here's what he writes in his note to, this is from the archive. I'm talking about factors that in 15-20 years will determine the face of the world, and therefore it is important not to miss out on anything substantial, i.e. the computer revolution. By the way, what happens to this memorandum? Brezhnev locks it in his drawer, and it's found there in November 1982 after he dies. So he knew about it. And then there was this other interesting idea at that time. Other Soviet economists, not Liberman, but a few others, they're saying, well, no, material incentive is not the problem. And I'm already getting to the end, I know. Material incentives are not the problem. What we really need to do is we need to solve our productivity of labor problem by introducing more computers and, in fact, creating computer centers around the country which will manage the plan. So this would be sort of like just more intelligent. Everything would be connected, and it was called, the idea, it was the system would be called the System of Optimal Functioning of the Economy, or SOFE. This was an idea by Soviet economists that was being also produced as a counterpart to the Liberman reforms and material incentives. Anyway, so you have this really interesting debate in the late 1960s, and in the end, neither the material incentives nor computerization actually go forward to the extent that they could. Because why? Because in the same time, in the late 1960s, the Soviets discover major deposits of oil and gas in Western Siberia. And they understand that this would allow them to postpone the resolution of the problem. Europe, in particular West Germany, came to bail out the Soviets with a gas pipeline deal. It was called at that time the deal of the century, that became the cornerstone of détente. So the conclusion and the final irony. The Soviet Union was able to postpone the debate on market versus socialism domestically because it became increasingly integrated from the early 1970s into the world energy market. It was selling oil and gas. Prices were very high because of the Yom Kippur War and what happened later. And they were allowed then to import goods in order to have for people to buy, right, with those rubles, and also grain. Postpone but not resolve. The problem returned with a vengeance in the mid-1980s. Gorbachev attempted to rehabilitate Liberman's reforms, but his efforts proved to be too little too late. The Soviet project was already in the dustbin of history. Thank you.
Splendid, thank you very much. Young people who went to university in the Soviet Union to study economics, what were they taught?
So they were taught Marxist economics, of course. Everybody had to study Marxism, Leninism, and read Das Kapital, which is very interesting, by the way, because the Soviet leaders themselves, I don't think, ever read Das Kapital. You know, you look at people like Khrushchev or Brezhnev, do you think they knew anything about Marxist economics? I don't think so. Khrushchev really had a hunch. He thought, okay, we'll tinker here, we'll tinker there, and we'll fix the economy. Brezhnev thought, well, what about we'll just give some material incentives? The younger people who then went into the system, they were properly trained, and we have real Soviet economics, right? The debates that I was talking about here in the late 1960s, there were really debates among knowledgeable people who saw problems with the plan. They understood that the plan was not working, and they were just trying to figure out whether it's just a fundamental problem with the plan itself, or whether you could, for example, include more computers into it, sort of like have an AI type, you know, the gigantic, gigantic computer system running the whole plan, maybe it would make it work, or whether the material incentive was the issue. But once they started giving the material incentive, the problem was the structure of the economy was still just, it just wasn't working because it was just still rigid, too rigid to work. So in the end, when it came to the late 1980s, they said, okay, you can't tinker with it. You have to really fundamentally upend the whole system, which is of course what happened.
All right, thank you.